Hi, everyone. Today, our subject will be cultural models. Now, we've talked about cultural models before when we looked at Naomi Quinn's book, Culture in Talk. But this week, we're looking at specific examples of cultural models and different ways that we investigate them. But I think it's worth taking a moment to review what is a cultural model and how does it differ from other kinds of ways that we might talk about systems of knowledge that are encoded in language. So I should say that cultural models is a particular framework within my subfield or sub-subfield of cognitive anthropology. And this is not the only way you could use to talk about the particular sorts of frameworks that we're going to be discussing, but it is one that I think is useful, and it's the one that we're going to use going forward. Just bear in mind that there are other sets of terminology that one could use, and that's perfectly fine. So in my view, cultural models are an answer to two fundamental questions. First, how do people, individuals, come to assign meanings to things? And secondly, how do people come to share those meanings in social settings? Cognition is individual, but culture is social. And how do we reconcile the two, or how do we bridge the two? How do we get from what any particular individual knows, believes, understands, to some understanding of social sharing? How do these things come to be shared collectively to some degree? Now, cultural models don't deny that there's variability among individuals. In fact, they require it. But it does require that we recognize that there are similarities across individuals that they're sharing. And this is fundamental to really all cultural anthropology, really all of anthropology, and really all of the social sciences. But what's different is that cultural models draw attention to intersubjective coordination. In other words, we want to understand how individuals negotiate and perceive that other people share similar meanings to themselves. And so when we talk, we are operating on a set of assumptions as if people might believe similar things to what we believe, or they recognize that another person might believe different things than we believe, and that we adjust our own meanings, in other words, our speech or our writing or other representations, to the context and to our perceptions of what other people are doing. The cognitive anthropologist Brad Shore says this in a really very evocative way, pointing out that cultural models have two moments of birth. First, a cultural model might emerge as a public convention, that something happens out in the world. But then the second birth is that it has to be subjectively, by the individual, appropriated and integrated into their way of thinking. So then there's a gap between the public and the individual, between the conventional and the subjective. And this is this constant process of contingent representation, integration, representation, integration. That's fundamental to how we link the cultural sciences to cognitive sciences. Cultural models insist that culture exists because of human cognition and is integrated with human cognition. Cultural models help us make sense of our experience. They draw our attention to some features of our environment and not others. They give us scripts to manage cognitively complex situations, and they provide frameworks through which we come to assign meaning to our experiences in daily life. So let me just give a brief example. I think a reasonable thing to consider as a potential cultural model, at least in most Western societies, is the concept of evolution. The concept of evolution predates Darwin by a long, long time, but it has taken on new resonances and new senses since Darwin and going forward. Evolution is a way of organizing certain forms of experience and certain kinds of knowledge about change. Now, how would we get at understanding what is evolution as a cultural model? There are lots of ways you could do it. One would be to draw on some corpus or some body of data, and we've done this many times before. Look at the words that are associated. Look at collocations. What is evolution described as progress? Is evolution described as change? Is evolution described in terms of stages? There are lots of different words or terms that you could use that might give you clues to what kind of cultural model evolution is. If you didn't have some pre-existing corpus of natural language, you might do some interviews. You might ask people, tell me some stuff about evolution. Now, of course, you want to recognize that people are going to vary in levels of expertise depending on their training, depending on their education, depending on all other sorts of attitudinal aspects of their lives. But we could do it. You could give people tasks, or you could give people surveys. You could, for instance, give a list of statements and get them to agree on a 1 to 5 scale. And we could see whether there's social sharing on some matter pertaining to this proposed cultural model of evolution. Or we could use things like imagery and diagrams. You're probably familiar with the progressive model of evolution, which is not really a scientific model in the contemporary sense, but it is still very predominant, of the so-called progression from chimpanzee to human, with different stages represented by different images, 4 or 5 different images, sort of pointing in a rightward way. Everyone's facing to the right in a standard page, moving forward in this cultural model. All right, so which of these should we use? Well, the answer, of course, is it really depends on what you're investigating and what kinds of data you have available. I think we should remain agnostic as to which of these is the best way. I don't think that's really the question I want to answer, and I think there are lots and lots of different approaches. But I want to point out that cultural models always raise more questions than they answer. So, for instance, you might hear somebody say that evolution is a theory. That's true. But what's a theory? This raises a further question. It's actually the debate over what's a theory that leads to a lot of discourse about evolution, in the teaching of evolution, and people don't have a very strong sense of what a theory is, and that creates all sorts of problems. They have this word, but they have different associations as to what it means. Or people might say things that suggest that evolution has stages, but this raises a different question. If biological change is continuous, what's a stage and how is it defined? An evolutionary scientist, a biological anthropologist, for instance, might insist that there's really no such thing as a stage in a scientific sense, and that may well be. But we are nonetheless very interested in the fact that a lot of people out there think that there are such things as stages. It's relevant to our understanding of what they're doing, and it's relevant to their behavior. So you can see that cultural models can be interlinked with one another or even nested within one another. That a cultural model for evolution is not simply a single entity existing out there in the world, but is linked to all sorts of other ideas. How do you know what you know about evolution? Maybe you learned it from school, but honestly, most people learn very little about evolution in school unless you're in a field like anthropology. More likely, you learned it from exposure to different sorts of patterns and different sorts of ideas, maybe in books, maybe in movies or popular media, maybe in imagery, and all of these are contributing to your understanding. Your ideas about evolution are not exactly the same as any other human beings on the planet. And that doesn't mean that cultural models don't exist, but what it means is that they're models. They're representations that help us to understand things that are widely shared, things that are commonly believed, and the way that different systems of knowledge interlink with one another. All right, I'll let you get into some examples on your own today on the discussion board. Thanks very much.